Thanks, Rochelle. What Rochelle didn't mention is that I've known her for, how long did we figure? 21 years. And it's thanks to Rochelle that I'm here. And thank you also to the Herbert as well. This is great. Strange connection to Whitehorse I just discovered, which is kind of amazing. So if we get the lights down right away, that would be great. As Rochelle mentioned, I'm basically a photo-based artist. I'm reluctant to use the term photographer because it conjures up certain kinds of ideas about what my photographs would look like or what anybody's photographs look like as soon as you use the term photographer. So I don't like to use that because I try to avoid those things. I try to avoid the traditional associations of the so-called photographic. And in fact, a lot of my practice hinges on the idea of probing or critiquing photography itself, which is sometimes a difficult thing to do. It's difficult to sort of make something and then simultaneously critique it. So a lot of my works have sort of started from that position, the idea of trying to understand the underpinnings of photography, or as we discovered this strange word that nobody seems to use approaching the image, is the conceits of the image. What's embedded in there that we don't really think about. So I've made a number of works that propose alternate readings, or at least try and sort of unpack, as it were, photographic or the photographic or photographicness. So I'm just starting with, and I'll probably cycle through a few images fairly quickly because I've got a lot here, and somebody will have to signal to me, hopefully Rochelle, when I'm...
I don't have a watch, so someone else will have to.
I'll just keep doing this, which is fun. And also, please feel free to interject or have any questions, but again, you'll have to get my attention somehow to let me know, and maybe just to, exclaim something loudly. I don't want this to be so much just talking at you. I'd like to for you to participate as much as you feel comfortable or want to. This photograph is called Yew, because it's a yew bush. And this was photographed in Brasher's Park in the Chiltern Hills, I think it is, at this residency that I did in 2001. After Rochelle had done it. I was aware of this residency because of Rochelle. And it's kind of an old manor house. It's actually Ian Fleming's childhood home, I found out. And runs a bit of a commune, but the gardens in it are sort of unkempt. There's a lot of effort it takes to maintain gardens, and so they had all these trees and bushes that at one time were, beautiful, presumably beautiful examples of topiary and kind of staged, or would. You would walk through the gardens and have kind of a staged visual experience. And so I wanted to kind of draw attention to this unkemptness of the bushes. And I staged at the time what I thought of as performances. So these lights were placed in front of the bushes and simply turned on for a period of time at the end of the night when people were after supper having their sherry on the porch or whatever it was. And people would just suddenly see these bushes suddenly lit. So it was kind of like a son et lumière show. Without any real son, just lumière. And so people would walk over and mill about. And then I started photographing these performances as really primarily documentation because I was loath, as I said before, to sort of make them outright photographs because of the associations of what traditional photography brings. And so then they did become outright photographs, and that's why the lights, or at least the performance part of it is why the lights stayed in. So I then started doing staging, looking for gardens where I would stage the same kind of thing, bring in lights and illuminate these things and make them, or at least hopefully emphasize the artificial nature, the constructed nature of garden design and the way that we think we would like to intervene or intercede or participate in nature. In America, there was an old sitcom called Family Ties, where every now and again they would, go outside and you'd see. It was clearly a stage set, and so my brother always referred to this one as Family Ties Goes Camping. So to kind of bring up that sense of the overt artificiality of the image and the constructed nature. So nature itself also becomes a bit of another kind of theme, or at least something that I'm using to another traditional format that I'm using to bring up photographic questions. And this one is called copse, which is just simply a copse of trees. And the idea here was to, again, to bring the aesthetic of the indoor studio to the outside world in order to render the kind of the outside world as potentially suspect, or at least render the truth, the apparent truth of photography suspect in this context. So you can see up here, there's, really with the single or just a very frontal light source, it flattens the image so you get these kind of shadows that you could almost read these trees as actually being cutouts, almost as if they were a stage set in an opera, something like that. And then I began to continue to actually remove the lights in the hopes that that same kind of character or that same kind of atmosphere of the image could be maintained without the lights. And I've gone back and forth with including the lights and not including the lights. And this is kind of a project that I've been doing for a long time called, now it's just sort of under the broad rubric of illuminated landscapes. And landscape in Canada is really important. It's important even though people don't think it is necessarily, because it's really part of it's sort of an embedded part of the Canadian identity. One way or another, people in Canada always have some sort of visual or physical relationship to the land writ large. Most of us live within cities, of course, but it doesn't take very long till you get into absolute wilderness. Just about a half an hour drive north of Ottawa, you have to be very careful about how far you drive because there's no more petrol stations after a while, so you don't want to get stuck. This is a photograph also shot in Banff National Park, where you just get this snow falling down. This is, it looks like rain, but it's actually snow. And I became really interested in how the lights end up lighting themselves in a way, and the kind of cyclical nature of images, that the subject, or the photography in a way, becomes its own subject. Another image also in Banff. And Banff is quite well known for being the site of a national park. And there is a town site, which is actually separate from the park, and then there's the park. And this is photographed right on the edge of the park. So the rocks that you see here and these trees in the front are inside the town site, and what's in the background and in the blackness is in the park. So this is right on the border. And the rocks and the trees in the front have been planted and positioned there on a road up to a little subdivision, right next to the so-called unadulterated nature that's in the park. And of course, both spaces are in some ways equally managed, but they're managed with different kinds of conceits in mind. One is managed to provide a road, as services to housing, but also managed to look like the exact thing that it's trying to replicate. So, and this is, in a way, for me, this is what photography exactly does. It sort of continually replicates its own conventions. And this is actually two photographs of the same position, or the same site. So you can see this rock here is actually that rock there. So, and it's reconstructed in kind of a false panorama. So I use a lot of the photographic conventions like panoramas and portraiture to and use those conventions to photograph other things that wouldn't be normally photographed using those conventions. So the tree photographs with the lights, are largely set up as if they're portraits, but they're not. And the landscapes you often use panoramas, which are actually not panoramas at all, because they're what I call false panoramas. So this is simply called white pine or eastern white pine. You can see the lights are obviously included there. And these two recent ones are shot in another sort of location which is quite well known in the Canadian mindset, which is in Georgian Bay, where a number of the painters of the group, from the Group of Seven, if you're familiar at all with Canadian art history or with the paintings of Peter Doig, the Group of Seven have been very important. They're kind of the one place in a very new country where we can sort of say this is distinctly and uniquely Canadian, particularly when it comes to the history of art. And so it's kind of filled with a kind of mythology and lore that of being, the kind of well, let's say it's a rugged landscape, inhospitable landscape, and and the paintings of the Group of Seven are often with lone pines, kind of windswept, are seen as kind of a metaphor for Canadian settler resilience. It's another boulder, simply called Boulder. The photographs are titled just simply as they are. I guess, again, as a nod to kind of acknowledging the photographicness of the photograph, which in some ways might seem obvious. So here's a photograph. This is called After Friedrich, hearkening Caspar David Friedrich's well-known sort of romanticized landscapes. And so this is the photograph, again, the light being photographed as a subject. And this is photographed in Baffin Island, which is very, very far north. It's just south of the Arctic Circle, actually, in Iqaluit, which is, again, it kind of holds this sort of, the Arctic as a construct holds this kind of mythology that I wanted to sort of investigate and play with and explore. So I've made a couple of trips to the Arctic to photograph and try and sort of understand what the nature of looking is in a place where day and night is often reversed or indistinguishable one from the other, where time and orientation don't really make much sense. Let's go back to that for a sec. It didn't help that while I was staying there, I was in a little B&B where the clock radio didn't work. And so I would wake up and it was night, day. I couldn't get any sense of what time it was, and the clock radio was continually telling me the wrong time anyway. So it was a complete, it was a place where you're completely immersed in kind of disorientation. And I wanted to try and sort of explore that photographically as well. And geographically, you have no sense of really, in some ways, what is up or down, because often the landscapes are equally white, sky, ground, and sometimes indistinguishable one from the other. So this work is just named after the place where it was shot, which is called Go Home Bay. This one is actually in London permanently at Canada House, which is the High Commission Embassy of Canada. And here are some more photographs from Georgian Bay, and some of these are photographed on an island called Artist Island, which is named for the Group of Seven. And has left on it an old hearth, the remnants, the ruins of a cabin at which they painted. And you can identify specific places where paintings were painted when you're in there. It's actually quite remarkable. So there was a painting by A.J. Casson that I could tell had been painted at that spot. He might have actually been inside the cabin when he painted it. And anyway, I've photographed these trees, and this is a work called Tree Corrections. And in Georgian Bay, the winds are such that the prevailing winds are so strong and so constant that trees and other vegetation actually grow crooked, as it were. And so what I've done here is to try and play a little bit with the conventions of landscape picturing by not rendering the horizon horizontal, but by correcting the trees. And so trees that grow sideways end up being straight, which thereby upends makes the actual landscapes all skew with. And some trees actually do grow horizontal. Of course, this one's not living. But it doesn't matter, they all get the same treatment. And experiencing this work is actually quite strangely, it's a simple manipulation, but it's actually quite destabilizing. It's, you're often, turning yourself back and forth trying to figure out how this actually works. And then, so it's not without its kind of, humor, and it's not without its kind of tongue-in-cheek dig at traditions of landscape photography or wildlife photography. So these are still, shot with limitless depth of field and nice saturated colors, which, in some ways is not really all that truthful. So that's probably as close as I'd get to conventional approaches to the photographic. Taking pictures of landscape is pretty straightforward in a way. But I also am really interested in the technologies of cameras and optics and photographic devices, and playing with them to sort of, again, question or to explore different alternate ways of reading images and ultimately probing photographic meaning. This is a series of works, or at least a performance work, called Aided Drawings, where I took a camera lucida. When a camera lucida, if you're not familiar, is basically a little prism on a rod. That's what I've got up here. And it's a tool that was invented in the early part of the 19th century, about 1807. It was a tool to draw. And it's the frustration with this tool that led Fox Talbot to actually invent the box camera, because Fox Talbot was trying to sort of recreate imagery using lenses and using optics and things like that. And he thought, oh, well, I'll just use this camera lucida. But he couldn't draw. You still have to know how to draw to use this thing. And it's quite annoying, actually. But some of the contemporary versions of them are actually quite useful. And of course, this became quite well known fairly recently when David Hockney started using them a lot and came out with this book that caused a little bit of controversy because he was basically claiming that many of the old masters had used the camera lucida, and most people interpreted that to mean that the old masters had so-called cheated instead of using their skills. But if any, it's a bit of a dubious argument because it is quite difficult to use, and you still have to know what you're doing with it. So I set about drawing various buildings in gardenscapes within this garden. And I would draw one of them, make one drawing from the position of my right eye and one from the position of my left eye, thereby kind of recreating a stereoscopic vision somewhat. And then the drawings get shown alongside this ridiculously non-portable, portable drawing table. And so you can see up here, there's actually two images drawn on top of each other. And it's quite a laborious process, and you end up with a very, very tiny drawings. That take quite some time. So other photographic tools that I've explored using, in addition to cameras and the camera lucida, are things like camera obscura, which is essentially the basis of all cameras. So camera obscura is simply a dark room with a hole punctured in one end that then creates an image upside down and inverted, or front to back, on the opposite wall, or in fact throughout the whole thing, frankly. And it's this principle upon which our eyes work, and all cameras, even the digital, work today. And so I've used, again, try and sort of as unpack photography or bring it down to its basic elements. I've made cameras with nothing but boxes. So it's kind of a large version of pinhole photography. And in response to trying to figure out how it is, what would the subject be if I'm trying to photograph photography or to probe photography itself, all I could think of really was to train my camera upwards to shoot what is ostensibly nothing: air, water vapor, clouds. And it's also happily one of the very well-known subjects of particularly American photographers, and most notably Alfred Stieglitz. So these are large 4x4, when I say 4x4 I mean feet, photographs that are actually paper negatives. So they're 4x4 foot paper negatives that get put into the camera and then wheeled out of the darkroom and trained upwards, and a brief exposure is made, and then they're developed basically inside the camera or inside a small room. So these are actually negatives. So what you see, what you're reading as clouds, are actually not clouds but empty space. So the cloud is where the darkest part is. But because they're clouds, they can be read either way. And these are some of Stieglitz's well-known equivalent series where he simply trained his camera skyward as well to try and claim some sort of artistry or creative authorship and claim photography as an equal or laudable art form as any other. But his are quite deliberately constructed. Mine are entirely arbitrary. So I'm actually trying to sort of divest myself of artistic authorship because I have no idea what's happening overhead as I do this. And so these are much larger ones. These are ones done with a full-sized, in a room. So there's a hole in the roof, and then these are projected down. These are 2 meters long, roughly. Again, single sheet, unique photographs, which in itself is kind of a counter to what photography is. It's based on its reproducibility and its multiplicity and its ability to easily, continually get more and more images from a single negative. But these are entirely unique objects that can't be reproduced. And there's a series of them all together. Does anybody have any questions? Questions at all? Okay. This is a video, and I was gonna say I have to get in really quick because there's sound starting soon, but there's no sound today, which is not really a problem. One of the other explorations that I've done is putting model cameras. These are radio frequency cameras on the nose cones of model rockets. And this happened long before the GoPro got really huge, and now we've got drones and everything. And so I haven't done as much of this lately because it's so easy to do. The results that you get from contemporary GoPro cameras are largely the same in some ways. But I was doing this for different reasons. I wanted to sort of put these cameras on rockets and launch them into the sky and not be too concerned about what was what we were seeing from above looking down, but simply what we were looking up. Again, the kind of shooting into the clouds to see what would happen. So these are a series of videos. It's kind of like my home version of NASA or Cape Canaveral. So that was the lead up to the launch, and then this is the launch here. So it's flying up. It goes up to about 5,000 feet or so, and then the parachute deploys, and then it slowly or violently, depending on the weather conditions, falls back to Earth. And again, upends the landscape and hopefully is quite destabilizing. I've actually had people who are quite uncomfortable looking at this. So, I don't know if there's any barf bags nearby, but I'm sure we can sort you out if you need to be sorted.
With the camera obscura, you keep it's a still situation.
In that case, yeah. But I've done another work, which I think I have coming up right now, where the camera obscura itself is part of the installation. And so you walk in and see the image from above.
I was just thinking in relationship to maybe the whole thing moving and seeing what happens when movements taking place.
In terms of if you leave the exposure too longer, you mean? Or?
If you leave the hole open and you say hoist a great big room on a balloon up into the sky and at some point you close the hole off. Right,
yeah, yeah. I'll just jump to that because that sounds like exactly what you're just describing. So here's a work that is called In Camera. and that's exactly that. So there's a hole in the roof, and you go and experience the camera obscura, not looking at any particular image, but looking at what ends up being quite like a vertigo-like experience. It's kind of like being over the bay doors of some sort of starship or something. You almost fall into the image. And I think I have some video of that too. So the clouds move by, and there is this kind of heightened sense of vertigo. So on days when it's, when it is cloudy and there's no kind of distinguishing features in the sky, which is often, it just becomes this inexplicably glowing, very minimal white square on the ground. Which I love the idea it's a photographic image that's completely, has complete fidelity to what's actually going on, but there's nothing there. You can't really discern anything. So it's in some ways a photographic conundrum that it purports to represent everything that's there, but you can't, it's unintelligible. So I like that kind of playing back and forth of those kinds of conundrums.
So you find the experience of this happening on the floor in the room a lot more interesting than creating a permanent image of it?
I don't know if it's a lot more interesting, but in some ways, yes, it's more interesting. I think that's, I think the argument I'm making, if I were making an argument, is that this is an equally important experience of the photographic as the still, and it's quite remarkable because we're so used to seeing large images or images at this scale projected using other forms of technology that we don't really see, like seeing an image that's that large and moving with no loss of so-called resolution, because resolution just doesn't apply. It's made with a lens. It's quite destabilizing. It's oceanic. It's almost blissful in some cases. I mean, and I've been really interested in camera obscura images for a long time. The kind of the state of the image always in the process of being formed at every single moment, and it's full color. Which doesn't really make much sense. But why wouldn't it make sense? I mean, of course it should be color. But while that image is going on the floor, I did take advantage of it to make some large scale prints. And I've also, the history of photography and painting is, sort of either antagonistic or lovingly intertwined. And so I've used camera obscura to try and be a painter. And this is a studio in the Banff Centre turned into a camera obscura, and then the back wall is stretched with canvas. And then I mixed up a series of colors that corresponded basically to Ansel Adams' own system of photography. So when I say colors, I mean grays. And then proceeded to try and paint the clouds as they moved across the so-called screen. And had to the bottom image here shows I'm holding a piece of paper and with a brush and trying to sort of see the image and paint behind it. So it was more of an exercise in discovery about how the image gets formed than a finished artwork. And then I've used gallery spaces to turn the gallery spaces themselves to turn into a camera obscura and photograph either the gallery or the view from the gallery. So the context of art display becomes its own subject, kind of a reflexive reversal in a way. So this is a view of 4th Street West, North Vancouver, as viewed from Presentation House Gallery Vestibule. A ridiculously long title, but I think the title should be difficult to say because it makes you spend more time thinking about it, perhaps. So this is, again, a negative because it's a large paper negative. So this is an 8 by 8 foot image. And here's an actual camera obscura in the gallery. This is in London, Ontario, which is nowhere near as big or as interesting, I think, as London, UK, but whatever. And so you can walk right into this camera obscura. There's a door there, and it has been already used to photograph the inside of the gallery in between exhibitions. So this is a fairly distinctive barrel vaulted ceiling in this gallery. So it's again a kind of attempt to have viewers participate in the images that or in image as it's being formed.
Have you had to do the image twice? Have you had to do, like, have it on one end and then do the other end? Or is it just 2 sheets of paper that connect from the camera?
In this case, 2 sheets of paper put at the same time. There's a lot of testing that is involved, of course, and this gallery was particularly lit badly. So, the exposure time on the, depending on the available light from the skylights, there was one exposure that was over 7 hours, I think, and then others that were quite literally 4 minutes. So it was it was difficult to kind of gauge just in terms of exposure. But yeah, these ones are done at the same time. So I'm also interested in, I guess going along with my interest in clouds, my interest in clouds is more to do with the evanescent, or at least in the photographing of things that are temporary or don't exist all the time, or that are so photographically and actually complicated that they can't really be depicted. Hopefully engendering a kind of suspicion in the activity of depiction itself. So these are a series of photographs shot at the base of Niagara Falls. And when I say the base, it's not like right at the base. It's very difficult to get to the base, but it's about 500 meters down from the falls where exists North America's largest set of standing waves. So it's a bit difficult to discern scale, and that's deliberate here. So this is a big chunk of ice, so this is during spring breakup, where chunks of ice the size of buses are going over Niagara Falls. This one is about the size of, well, it's about this big, just to get a sense, about the size of a car tire. And so these are basically 5 to 6 meter waves that form, and these are all photographed with high-powered flash at night in order, again, to try and remove the context from them so that you get this sort of endless black space that suggests that these may be staged. Some people have actually claimed that I've just done this in a teaspoon. I then tried that. It's really hard, and it doesn't work. It doesn't look like this. So there's kind of an inconceivable complexity that is involved in the information that's presented here. And it's kind of I guess in some ways, a questioning of that very notion of photography as information. And again, I'm interested in photographing sites or events or that are not permanent, that don't remain. And more recently, and I'll show you some towards the end. Just check the time here. Okay. That are similar in some ways. Again, water as a subject, or the ostensible subject is water, but it's not really about water per se. But I'll get to that in a way. And I've also considered these part again of my sort of the ongoing project of the illuminated landscapes. And all the photographic conventions here are, I think, for those techno or photophilic techno people, which I don't consider myself one of those actually, but they're, we assume that with so-called landscape photography and this kind of photography that you would have limitless depth of field where everything is in focus, that somehow that's a truer image or a truer representation of what it is that's being depicted. So here there's a very limited depth of field, and all the and the background is thrown into somber blackness. And following on that, I wanted to try and talk about or at least explore the relationship that photography has to sculpture in addition to painting. And I began to think of that blackness that I was beginning to depict and use a lot in photography as being not only about image, but also about object. And so this is a piece called Stillwater, which is the photographic portion of it. Well, in truth, the photographic portion is the whole thing. But the thing that is recognizably photographed is down here, and this is water falling in this direction. I don't know if you can see that with my hand, over a weir, over a small, like, kind of little dam. And then the blackness is empty space. The blackness is just sort of indeterminate nothingness behind. But yet, in this incarnation sculpturally, the blackness becomes a black object. And so you can actually stand in front of this, and if the wall behind is lit correctly, you can actually read this as negative space or positive space, depending on how you, depending where you stand and how you think of it. And so I really love that kind of interplay between image, object, and how those two things can kind of collapse into one another. And this is what that looks like from behind and a bit of a close-up. Michelle will recognize that gallery. Peak.
Oh.
Right? Oh, right, okay. This is a series called Corone, and these are made, I just mentioned the word collapse, and I love that idea. I love failures. For those of you who were in the seminar this afternoon, you may have read that. But I love the idea of collapsing, of trying to sort of either unpack or push things together. This was a series that I also started in 2001, where I tried to dispense with the camera entirely and just work with film. It was also a moment where, the whole digital versus analog debate was at its height, and it was kind of a pointless debate, frankly. But what people often didn't think about when they were talking about, is digital better? Is photography as material and photosensitive materials, and how there's a lot of there's a lot about those that are valuable that aren't necessarily related to the activities of depiction, which is the kind of, again, the conceit of most photographic processes, that it's largely about depicting things. So this is an attempt to try and collapse both the thing that records the image and the thing that forms the image. So these are made without cameras, and these are made by simply drilling holes into 35 millimeter photographic slide film, and then rephotographed and enlarged quite substantially. So they're not strictly speaking abstract, because there is some reference there, and it's also, it could be read as either astronomically large or microscopically small, but it's indeterminate. And it's that very indeterminacy that I'm interested in. And they're also really darn nice to look at, which is never a bad thing when you're an artist. So this is another work called Nox Borealis, which was also photographed on one of the trips to Nunavut in the Arctic. And so what you have at the top are upside down, just sort of empty images of, and it's not reproducing very well in this image here, but this is snow, just like landscape snow. And then these big sheets of empty space, and the substrates here, the supports upon which the photographs are placed, are curved, and again pushing the so-called photographic information into the three-dimensional realm. I don't know if that reads any better, perhaps not, but yeah. And then I've also taken them right off the wall and just propped them up against each other to create sort of independent objects. Another work from the Arctic. This one is called After Kurlik. Again, in response to some of the conventions of painting and a particular Canadian landscape painting tradition. William Kurlik was a Ukrainian-Canadian prairie folk painter, as it were. He's kind of been referred to numerous times as Canada's Bruegel. He had this propensity to paint prairie landscapes with a lot of snowbanks in them, and the snow itself becomes this kind of only slightly acknowledged character in the settings for many of these sort of genre scenes. Again, the snow disappears, it doesn't exist, it kind of creates temporary landscapes. Particularly right now in Ottawa, as we left yesterday, there are some massive snow piles which become these temporary mountains that just don't exist sometimes the next day, but often they stay for quite a bit longer. So again, scale is deliberately indeterminate here. You can't tell how big this is. In truth, it took us about half an hour to walk from there up to the top of here. So it's kind of this almost snow wave, wind blown and kind of curling over. And again, it's constructed as a false panorama. So this part of the image is repeated in each image. So you might, while your desire at first is to perhaps read it simply as a panoramic image or two images that come together to create a depiction, that depiction is deliberately rendered perhaps dubious because it's actually the same image twice, but not quite. I was going to skip this, but I think you get the point with that. That was a piece called After Snow, which is a direct homage to or remaking of or sheer ripping off of Michael Snow's famous film La Région Centrale, which kind of slowly probes the Arctic landscape with this automatic camera upside down and inverted, and it lasts for hours. Mine is about 40 seconds long, and it's just me swinging the camera over my head. These are iPhone drawings of clouds. I don't know how well they're reproducing here. They're far more sensitive, I think, when you actually see them. So these are just drawn with the finger. Some of them are long, some are sometimes not even looking. And this was, I actually used the same program that David Hockney was using. I found out about it because, and this is just when all iPhones were first coming out, and so I wanted to. I call these photogenic drawings. Again, hearkening the very important history of that photography has, and particularly Fox Talbot's initial explorations with, and having called his book The Pencil of Nature, and calling his first photographs photogenic drawings. And I've also explored a number of other historical techniques, again, in an effort to try and sort of, I guess, understand or challenge all the kind of ways that photographic images get produced, which sadly I think today is far too unitary. We universally accept either the phones on our the cameras on our iPhones or commercially available digital cameras without really thinking about how these, in what way the manufacturers actually influence profoundly the way that images look. And we assume that many of those conventions are perhaps innocent, when in fact they're not. They're very carefully constructed. So anyway, getting back to this, this is a series of wet plate collodion photographs, which wet plate collodion was a technique that was invented in the 1860s that required you to sensitize a plate and then photograph it use the plate within about 15 minutes. And so these are photographs that are cloud-like, but what they are the paper towels that were used to prepare the plate. And so it's a deliberately self-reflexive gesture. So in a way, it's kind of a precursor to photography photographing itself. And this last one here is actually an ambrotype, which is the same process, just simply on glass. And this is actually a negative. So placed against a black ground, it reverses to our eyes and turns into a positive. And there's a series of the wet plates, the photogenic drawings. So these are the pinhole, the iPhone ones. And then there's another pinhole photograph of clouds shot with a cookie tin in Brandon, Manitoba, which is as flat as everyone will tell you it is. Another large camera obscura image using a gallery as camera obscura. So these are 4 by 8 feet. And then some more, having returned to Georgian Bay, I shot some more photographs that were using the same visual format, basically of leaving the tops of the images completely empty and using a high-powered flash to deliberately throw that into a kind of emptiness of black indeterminacy, while photographing the one of the parts of Georgian Bay that is equally well known is these massive granite rocks, part of the geological feature known as the Canadian Shield, which is a huge geological area that covers most of James Bay and Hudson Bay. Very tightly controlled depth of field, such that you're not really sure of the scale, potentially miniaturized, potentially constructed. But in fact, there's next to no manipulation here in terms of Photoshop or anything like that. It's just enough that photographers always have to do in order to get things to print out. So they're just essentially straight from the camera shots. And that's another. And then playing with the conventions of both photographing things and photographic display and exhibition, upending things or putting them on their side. So these are 2 landscape photographs that shouldn't really be this way, but create another kind of imagery or another potential form in the convening between the 2 of them. Just checking time. I'm not sure what. Am I right that I've got about 5 minutes left? Yeah, okay. These are, again, similar to the Corona series, drilling holes just through the box of film and making the film its own camera, which essentially results in very little. And the sheet of film itself becomes the thing that gets viewed. And under the correct lighting conditions, there's a lot of lights here. You can see 3, if not more, distinct shadows, which become equally part of the aesthetic composition as the object itself. And recently, this is something that I've been doing, started doing just last year. Again, in an effort to kind of either turn things upside down or inside out, and as strategies to try and challenge the conventions of photography, I began to wonder what it would be like to turn a camera inside out. And so that was kind of just a question that started, and then it led me to think about, well, what is photography first? I mean, what is the core element that allows photography to happen? And it's silver, at least traditional photography. And so silver is uniquely on the inside when you're taking pictures. What if you put silver on the outside? So I started figuring out how to do this, and it's called, it's a bit of a misnomer, but it's called spray chroming, and it does deposit a thin layer of silver on top of your whatever objects undergoes the treatment. And then they're positioned, in this case a Yashica matte camera is positioned inside a mirrored box so that you get this endless repetition of the apparatus of the camera. And it also renders it unusable, but it's kind of again, the picture sort of is being formed all the time in a way. And this is another work called, let me get this right, Disused Portrait Camera Considers Wedgwood Vase. So on the left here you have a small jasperware vase made by Wedgwood. And Wedgwood is arguably the earliest photographic process that ever happened, early in the late 18th century, late 1700s. Wedgwood was experimenting with light-sensitive glazes with compounds of silver. Wasn't obviously able to find a way to fix them, but actually had noted that this worked, and that this was essentially a photographic or proto-photographic process. Of course, the word photography was nowhere near being in existence yet. And then this is a much more recent portrait camera with a double lens, and that awkward thing up there is a flash, believe it or not. And that's what it ends up looking like. So there's kind of like, this recreation of the still life in this endless hall of mirrors where the object itself, where the object actually happens, I'm not really sure after a while. It's kind of a strange, you get lost in this kind of thing. Here's a couple of disused twin Hawkeye Brownie cameras that are, so there's no mirror in the middle here. These are actually two cameras that are upended. One of them is upside down, placed on top of the other. So the play of reflections is repeated in the actual objects. Okay. This is a work called Viz, V-I-Z period, which is a Latin contraction of videre licet, which means is permitted to see. And this is what I think of this as a photograph with everything that a photograph contains except depiction. So we've got black surfaces and silvered surfaces and surfaces that undulate and change and turn. And this again is all done with the silvering process. So they're completely mirrored reflective surfaces. And I've got a bunch of other stuff, but I think I've run out of time. So I didn't get to the Dawson photographs. Someone had asked me to talk to those, but I'll talk to you about it later. And I just wanted to give you a quick sense of what the work that's going to be in London. So this work is called Surge, and this was photographed at Yellowstone National Park, which is the most geothermically active place on the planet. There are, in this one location, there are 300 geysers that are going off all the time. And the world's largest geyser is here as well. And it's not actually Old Faithful, but it is at that location. So this is a mock-up of what will be installed, I hope, tomorrow at the gallery. And this is the piece that Rochelle was mentioning will be up for pretty much till the end of the year, I think. So if you're in Harrow, which not many people are, I hear, then please stop by. And unless there's any other questions, I'm finished my time.